Well, welcome everyone to the PARC Forum. My name's Stuart Card. Today's forum is the fifth talk in our special speaker series on going beyond Web 2.0. The power of the web for connecting people, collaboratively co-creating knowledge, enabling enterprises to use social software, and so on. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to let you know about the previous talks are now available on our online archive at www.parc.com/forums. This includes Social Tex's Ross Mayfield, who spoke about how all things on Web 2.0 are made of people, Garrett Camp on the Stumble Upon Web Discovery System, Charlene Lee of Forrester on strategies for winning in a world transformed by social technologies, and Guy Kiyosaki on the numbers of launching a Web 2.0 business. Next Thursday's forum, which will be presented by Chris Anderson, editor-in-chief of Wired magazine and author of The Long Tail, is entitled Free, the Past and Future of a Radical Price. One of the things we've tried to do with this series is to represent different perspectives on going beyond Web 2.0 by covering different technologies, business models, and approaches. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Bernardo Huberman of HP Labs, who provides a theoretical experiment, or a theoretical perspective on this. Bernardo is actually a real scientist. Bernardo is a senior HP fellow and director of the Information Dynamics Lab at Hewlett Packard Laboratories. Of course, we think of him as a former senior research fellow here at PARC, so we think of him as presently at HP. Bernardo received his PhD in physics from the University of Pennsylvania and is currently a consulting professor in the Department of Applied Physics at Stanford. Bernardo likes to work where, as he says, you can't yet see the footprints in the sand. He's often, therefore, the guy who opens up new areas. He originally worked in condensed matter physics, where he made contributions in the theory of critical phenomena and low-dimensional systems and many other things. He's one of the pioneers of chaos theory. He discovered ultra-diffusion in hierarchical systems. Amazingly, his approach has also uncovered regularities that govern network and social behavior. He worked out the effects of group structure on the ability of groups to solve hard problems, for example, when he was at PARC. He discovered a number of strong regularities, such as the dynamics that govern the growth of the World Wide Web and why web surfing leads to traffic congestion problems. He's worked on the design of novel mechanisms for privacy and trust in e-commerce. Presently, his work centers on novel mechanisms for discovering and aggregating information. So, without further delay, I give you the foremost theoretician of the web and its uses, Bernardo Huberman.
Wow. Thank you, thank you. Wow. Thank you, Stu. This is a very, very special occasion for me. I grew up at PARC scientifically, and it's very, very special to be here and to hear these words of praise from someone I truly, truly admire and work with for many years. So actually, the only correction to that incredibly generous introduction is that I'll be presenting a lot of data, not just theory. And I would like to start this by, first of all, dealing with Windows. And getting back to the presentation somewhere. Okay, let me just go back. Okay. So here is the title of the talk. I would like to, actually, I had a very interesting conversation not long ago with Kevin Kelly, one of these people that actually seem to be always with one finger into the future and knowing what it looks like. And one of the things that impressed me about this whole phenomenon of the web, which I witnessed here while I was still a researcher at PARC, is that if you really think back about 50 years ago, the world consisted of a very few people that created content, and most of us consumed it. I mean, there was, a collection of people that made music. There were people who wrote books. There were people who wrote papers and so on. But the ratio of those who were producing something that was read by others to the number of people that actually had access to that was very, very small, because basically the access to that production mechanism and the media and so on was extremely restricted for most people. And this actually happened, centuries ago, and it actually stayed there till very few years ago. Today the situation has reversed. Anyone can produce content, and very few people actually read it or even consume it. And witness the immense, desperate attempts that people have at essentially, having their voices heard. And this is something that actually I think is rather profound. It actually says something about our own society, and it says something about the way we're going. And actually, it gave a lot of interesting food for my own research, which actually, some of it I'm going to show you today. The work that I actually do today at HP Labs has two components. One of them is really to understand this whole phenomenon of social dynamics and the age of the web that I think most of us are part of. And the other one is actually to take that research and to make it into something useful, not only for Hewlett Packard, but for people who eventually can actually use these things. And we design a lot of interesting new mechanisms that allow you to actually tap that knowledge that is being generated and put it to good use. Most of the work I'll describe today is not on that side, although you can. Some of it is actually available publicly, and I'll mention some of it as well. I was here about 3.5 years ago or so, and I talked about the work we're doing on discovering communities and predicting the future. So today is really a work that has taken place since then. So let me get going here by showing you one of my favorite examples of what I meant before. This is a very beautiful painting, I think, by Bruegel of a village feast in the late 1600s. And the reason I show you this is not to impress you with nice art, but actually to imagine what would happen if a bunch of sociologists were to parachute in a village during the time of this feast and try to understand the connections and interactions among the people. And sociologists still do that one way or the other, through surveys and all sorts of things. And you could see that it would be extremely hard to discover not just who's the mayor of the village, who's in charge of certain things and so on, but actually how does commerce get transacted? How do people influence each other? Who is interested in given people and who is actually perhaps plotting bad things and good things and so on? It would be very, very hard because the tools that you would have at your disposal then, even today, traditional tools of sociological research, are extremely limited when you try to really capture the essence of what's really going on there. Now, I was at PARC actually when I realized that there is another way of describing these kinds of social dynamics, which is actually to resort to a limit where the village is very large. When the village, in terms of people, gets very large, then you can start seeing some statistical regularities, and some of these regularities sometimes can be very surprising. It is a little bit like, and I used to argue this with one researcher that used to be at PARC, the difference between arguing about whether or not you understand the intentionality of someone driving a car, why is she driving, where, and what is she thinking, as opposed to essentially predicting traffic patterns at a traffic light at, say, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon in a city. Okay? That's basically the kind of approach that I'm really advocating. Now, if you start looking at things on a large scale, you miss a lot of interesting details, and that's something that we need to acknowledge. But sometimes you gain enough knowledge from these things to actually decide that perhaps it's worth the enterprise. And this is what you'll have to decide after I'll show you some of the results of the work that we are doing. Okay, so let me start by just giving you an example of a regularity. I could speak for 1 hour about a piece of work that we did about a year ago or so with Scott Golder and Dennis Wilkinson, but I'd just like to sort of impress upon you this kind of situation where the regularities only become manifested in the very, very large number of people or interactions or messages. So what I'm going to show you is a study we did of Facebook. I don't think I have to introduce Facebook to anybody today. A year and a half ago, some people in Europe did not even know what it was. But it's a massive social network. There have been many social networks before Facebook. There will be many social networks after Facebook. But this is, of course, the one that everybody cares about, used by millions of students, enterprise employees, and so on. And I don't think I have to explain to you what Facebook is about or what people use it for. And I really don't, at some level, I don't really care too much about it. People at Facebook care. But what I did care was, how is it that people interact with each other? And there are many ways people do so, but most of the time they send messages to each other. They send emails, and they send something called pokes. Those of you who use Facebook know about it. Those of you who don't, they'll be surprised that a poke is just a poke. You send a message to them and say, hi, basically, and someone sends back another poke and says, hi, and there are poke wars and things of that sort and so on. But basically, people are just sending messages to each other all the time. And it's a phenomenal group of people that are doing this work. And so we decided to take a look at Facebook. I was interested in a particular thing I'm going to show you, just sort of, this is sort of the appetizer for the talk. And what we wanted to look was actually at how is it that people email each other without looking at the content. So this is the analysis we did. 4.2 million users at that time, 500 schools. There are many more today. Around 41 million users of Facebook. There are about 72 million of MySpace, 72 million people. It's larger than many countries, okay? So we wanted to see how users communicate with and when. And so what I'm going to show you now is just give you an idea. So we looked at emails, the time an email is sent by someone, okay? Thank you. Sartorial problems. So we wanted to see if there was any pattern to the way people email each other. Remember that Facebook is essentially operating worldwide. I mean, there's a lot of people in the United States. We just wanted to see if people email at particular times more often than others and so on. And what came out was quite surprising. And so I'm going to show you just, look at this. This looks very much like a heartbeat almost. I mean, you could put an electrocardiogram to something and it would look like this, and for a fairly healthy person, okay? And so here you are seeing a phenomenal pattern that repeats extremely, in a very, very particular, regular way. It is not all the email sent, so there is a big background below that of messages that are being passed. But it is rather remarkable that without any external synchronization whatsoever, correcting for all the time zones and so on, when we look at the time at which emails are sent to each other and responded to, and pokes and so on, for pokes we saw the same thing, you get the same pattern. There are all sorts of interesting implications. As I said, we've given talks on this topic that last very long, and I don't think that this is what I really want to do today. But actually, I wanted to show you that this is not just one day. We actually did it by days of the week. So you see that basically the only interesting thing you see is that during the weekend there is a pattern decrease. It's actually people become more social in a non-email messaging type, okay? And these were emails that I was showing you between different schools. Intra-school patterns are basically the same and so on. Okay, so this was, as I said, the appetizer. You see, you look at things at the level of 4.5 million people exchanging millions of messages, and a signal starts appearing that you would never imagine exist if you were to look at 150 people sending emails to each other, or perhaps 5 or a million. Okay, you need a lot to start seeing these signals, okay? And they have some interesting implications for, from network congestion to the kinds of communications you see and so on. But I just wanted to use this as an introduction. So now I'm going to really go into another example of something very large, which actually interests me for 2 reasons. The first one was that while I was actually here at PARC, I was asked once to write an essay for the Stanford Humanities Review, something a scientist usually doesn't get asked to do. And so I felt that since my fellow scientists would not see, all these sinful type of activities that I would engage in, I wrote an article that I called The Social Mind. I was very interested after the discussion I had through a visit at CMU with Herb Simon, in this whole idea that intelligence is not just something between our 2 ears, it's something that is manifested in the workings of many people. And there were lots of examples, the economy is one. I mean, there are many other examples of a social mind of kind. The problem I always had was very, very hard to measure that, to see it manifested in anything other than the workings of a technology community or things of that sort. And sometimes when you look at the behavior of large nations and so on, you wonder what kind of intelligence you see. But regardless of the qualifications or the IQ that you measure, you actually see this output as being very interesting. Now, a couple of years ago, I became very, very interested in Wikipedia. And I actually use it a lot, and I know some of you, Etchi in particular, and collaborators, you've done some work there too. So I became fascinated by this phenomenon of people essentially generating knowledge, okay? And here you have it. I mean, you know, I don't have to explain to you what Wikipedia is, but it's a phenomenal thing where knowledge is being generated essentially at zero cost to anyone. There is no reputation associated, there is no utility one way or the other, or disutility. And yet, somehow, this rather utopian project has acquired a life of its own, and is actually useful. I find it useful. Many people find it useful. So I think that this is something that is really worth paying attention to. The profit motive is not there. People are doing it in an incredibly altruistic fashion. And so the question was, well, if Wikipedia is the expression of a social collective intelligence, how good is that intelligence? Because as you know, many people argue that given the low quality threshold to produce anything, why is it that you would actually expect anything to be interesting or even truthful, okay? And so all of you know how it works. I mean, there are editors that are correcting each other and so on. So my conjecture was, well, perhaps articles that are heavily edited are the ones that are actually the good ones. So a colleague of mine said the opposite. A good article doesn't need any editing, so perhaps it's the articles that have almost no edits that are going to be the authoritative ones and so on. So we decided to look at this in a very, very neutral fashion. So what we did, I mean, there are many things you can do with Wikipedia. As I said, you know, PARC is a place where also people study these things. But let me tell you what I decided to do. Very simple, very clean, okay? So we were basically looking at that time, there were 7.2 million articles and so on. So we decided to look at the edits in Wikipedia. So we studied 52 million edits. I mean, again, the scale of these things is incredible when you think about it. I mean, we, you know, it was in 1998 or so with our colleagues, actually some of them here, we discovered the law of surfing, and I think that that was a law because about 1 million people were essentially measured. And, you know, look at the kinds of things you're looking today at, okay? So there you are. You look at these edits by people that are, some of them are absolutely obsessed about editing, and they spend their days and nights editing and so on. You know, we've looked at some of them, and it's quite remarkable what you see there. But regardless of that, I wanted to look at the distribution of, say, edits in Wikipedia. So here I'm looking at it on a log-log plot. So when you see a straight line in a log-log plot, basically means you're seeing a very long power law, a tail. So you see that the number of users that produce edits, okay, is such that most users, you know, essentially are editing 1 or 2 articles and that's it. But there is a tail on the right-hand side of that plot that shows you that there are some people are doing rather abnormal things, you know. There are a couple of them. I've been tempted over the last 3 or 4 months to send them an email saying, get a life, you know. It's, it's an amazing thing when you look at this. And, you know, actually you can see the activity being generated. So here you have a plot. And you have a plot where it says, okay, so there are most articles don't get many edits. These are the articles that are heavily edited. I mean, there is a whole subsection of Wikipedia that has very controversial content, political and historical and so on. So that's a whole issue in itself. I won't go into that. So the conjecture was, okay, well, now there are 2 conjectures. Is it on the left or on the right that we see quality here? Okay, so this is a very long study that I did with Dennis Wilkinson. So I'm going to show you here basically the sort of the essence of it. And actually, indeed, you see here that editing increases the article quality. Now, how do we do that? There were 2 ways of doing it. One of them was to take every single article of Wikipedia that we were looking at, you know, 52 million edits of millions of articles, and put them through the Google PageRank system. Now, if you see, if some of the good articles, the heavily edited articles, are the good ones in the sense that they have high PageRank, you still could come back and say, well, high PageRank because other articles are pointing to them. That's not necessarily a sign of good quality. But it turns out that Wikipedia has something called featured articles that are truly the good quality ones as well, and they are singled out by the editors of, you know, the Wikipedia. So what you see there, and I hope that you can all see the upper curve. This is, again, it's a very, very nonlinear behavior here. The upper curve are all the featured articles, okay, are the most heavily edited ones, and you see indeed are much more edited than the ones that are non-featured articles. And the PageRank correlates with the featured articles as well as you move to the right, okay? So this is a trend in one plot. I could show you many others, but it actually indicates indeed that this activity of people almost randomly producing articles, others editing and so on, leads to overall work that on average is good quality. I'm not going to tell you that every article you're going to read there is going to be absolutely truthful and, you know, accurate and so on. I mean, there are articles in Wikipedia that you have to read at your own risk. But nevertheless, there is a very, very strong trend, and actually it's a very, very good thing to actually notice, because it gives us a sense that indeed these intuitions we have about groups collaborating, even selfishless, in a selfishless fashion, you know, it actually produced something very interesting. Okay, I mean, there is an attempt today of trying to see if we can, you know, Wikipedia could become something better by essentially giving an identity to the authors and editors and so on, which is a little closer to scientific productivity, but, you know, so far it's actually doing very well. It's growing and still very healthily all over the world, and so I think that this is a very, very nice sign that indeed is a good thing. I must tell you that Jimmy Wells actually has quoted our work as he likes it, but he doesn't like the word collective intelligence that I use. But I really think in that sense, we are witnessing something that if someone from another planet were to read, would actually consider something like, a very interesting result of many people interacting with each other. I don't know how many of you have seen the kinds of editorial wars that go on in there. It's really something that actually leads to interesting behavior and actually improvement. So let me now move to the next chapter of this, which actually is one that I am very, very involved in, and it has very practical implications as well, which is the phenomenon of attention. This is something that I've been very interested for many reasons, but one of them was reading a very short paragraph in an article by Herb Simon on a book of collected works that actually someone who had left PARC left on my desk one day, and I'm flipping the pages, and there I was. I saw this, and so it was a very interesting observation that Herb Simon made many years ago, which was, and this was long before the web, which was we were entering an era where actually information, which used to be the very scarce thing that people pay a lot of money for, was starting to become more and more ubiquitous and therefore less expensive. But the only thing you could actually not make more available was the ability of people to attend to that information. So when you really think about it, it's a very interesting thing because economics is all about scarce resources. We pay for things that are scarce. We don't pay any longer for ballpoint pens that you can find in any store that they ask you to sign a bill for. Many years ago, people actually did not get ballpoint pens for free because they were expensive to produce. Same thing with pocket calculators. Today you can get them almost for free at a service station or whatever. So, but attention, this ability that we have to attend to something is something that is finite, not only because us as biological entities cannot attend to everything at the same time, we also have to sleep, we have to eat, we have to do other things as well. So information whose value has collapsed to zero, as you all know, you can go to the web and find out anything you wanted to find out 10 years ago, 10 years ago you had to pay consultants to tell you things, or doctors or travel agencies to tell you about things. Today you can find out all about, for free essentially in the web. The problem is the opposite now. How do I get your attention? How do I get people to pay attention to what I'm saying? Now, you are unfortunately all captured here in this room because I'm speaking and you have no option other than walk out, but there are not that many things that are coming at you at the same time. But on a daily life, as a scientist, as a worker, anything, you have all this stuff that is coming at you, and you have to decide what to prioritize. And if you don't decide, they'll decide for you, which means they'll invent strategies to essentially make you pay attention to things, sounds, visual stuff, and all sorts of things. Advertising is so good at, and so on, or bad, or whatever, but we do pay attention to things. Okay, so this is really what I believe is a very, very interesting problem, and we've been doing a lot of work on it. I'm going to show you some of the results of this thing, which I think that you might find of interest. So this is basically what I said before, but I'd like to basically tell you what the two problems are. There are two problems, basically from the provider of information that wants your attention and you as a user or consumer. The provider is, how do you present the most salient things to someone so that the attention will be, your attention will be fulfilled, or your need for that information essentially will be fulfilled without you drifting to something else because you're bored, you don't care, or it's useless. And the other one is, if I'm a user and I am confronted with enormous amounts of stuff, what is it that I have to do, or can someone do something for me so it will be condensed or distilled in a form that I can digest in the finite amount of time that I have, given my mental capacity. You can be a child, you can be an adult, and so on. So our work actually here has been both to understand this very, very carefully and also to design tools that actually we are using inside Hewlett Packard, and with a couple of test pilots we are doing outside, to dynamically configure sources of information so as to get from you the most attention. And you also feel, you the user, that you are getting a lot of utility from it. Now, I'm not the first one to say that to look at the economics of attention is interesting. Don't misunderstand me. A lot, people have said that. But I want to be a little more careful here because it turns out that it's not always a problem. And this is something that, there is an economist, Falkinger, who actually has done a lot of very interesting theoretical work about this in a very technical sense. So I'm going to distill some of these ideas in a very simple visual way. So there are certain landscapes in which we move in the world, when we attend to things, that are actually information poor, so it's not a problem. There is no contention for your attention. Let me give you a very simple example. This is an information poor environment. Okay, I chose that out of the web. I think it's very nice. There you're driving, there's a thing that says stop. I mean, there's not much that is distracting you unless you have lots of stuff in your car or whatever, on your horse or whatever that is distracting you from stopping there. But nevertheless, this is a very simple thing. So if you have an environment like this, and there are many societies today that still are information-poor societies, basically there is no contention for your attention. It's easy for you to consume most of it, okay, or all of it, okay. Now let me give you the opposite regime, which is the one that actually I'm very interested in, which is this one. My friend Howard Reingold in Tokyo, looking at all this incredible array of things. I mean, I think it looks very nice that he's sort of bewildered by all of it. And I would be too, if only because I don't speak Japanese. But even if I did, it would be very hard to decide what is it that you want to attend to when you are bombarded with all of this. Okay. That's basically the problem that I really think is very interesting. So if you're in an information-poor environment, there is no issue. In information-rich environments, you have to start deciding what is it that you're going to present to people and so on. Okay. Now, from the point of view of the broadcaster, the people who are trying to get your attention, there are basically two ways that people try to do so. One of them is what I would call generically, I mean, there are many ways of doing it, is essentially broadcasting. So I like pictorial things. So here's an example of broadcasting. See, so all these penguins are essentially attending to one signal, you know, basically. They're all attending to the same thing. And so this is one way of attending to the attention of all these penguins. It would be very interesting if you were to broadcast many things at the same time. They might be as bewildered as we are sometimes, or Mr. Reingold when he's in. There's another way of sometimes getting attention of people without broadcasting, which is very fashionable nowadays, and it goes under the name of viral marketing. Okay, and this is basically what Rockwell captured many, many years ago. It's a very nice idea. People tell each other things, and eventually gets to be known. The notion of viral marketing is an extremely powerful one. As you know, many people in marketing and companies and so on believe that if you can actually engage people in viral, reach people through a viral marketing campaign, you don't have to spend much money. All you have to do is tell those people that are hubs of some social network, and everything else is just going to propagate very nicely. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is actually show you some examples of the study of this phenomenon, in particular in viral marketing. And so I'm going to do that in two ways, so you see the kinds of things you can do. One, the network, the social network way, and the other one, the temporal domain, okay? I'm very conscious of the time, so I'll try to go a little bit faster if necessary. So we were very interested in this, so we wanted to see how effective things like viral marketing are. Everybody talks about it. So I was very lucky. 2.5 years ago or so, I got a phone call from a student at actually a CMU who says, I'd like to be your intern. I said, well, what do you do? He said, well, perhaps I shouldn't tell you what I do, but what I have. I have a whole database from Amazon on sales and all this viral stuff and so on. So I said, come over. So Yuri Lefkovitz came and spent a lovely summer with us, with Lada Damic and myself. And what we did was to actually study a phenomenal amount of data, raw data that Amazon had on recommendation systems and so on. So I'd like to show you basically the kinds, rather than showing you equations and theory and so on, it's not, I'm not perverse trying to contradict Stu, I just want to show you the kinds. So I'm showing you two very different examples of purchasing patterns here. So on the left, you're looking at a pattern of essentially of people who bought medical books. Let me tell you what this graph is. Every dot is a person that recommended to a bunch of people, those are the lines, and is connected to other dots who bought the same book. Okay, so if someone, I hope that everybody can see, but I'll just choose one here. So someone bought this medical book, recommended to many people, of which only 4 bought it. This is what you see, the 4 that bought it, okay? That's basically it. So here you see an example of medical book, that basically medical books that, this is the way we're representing them. So you see that basically the thing propagates not very far, but on the other hand, how many people buy medical books and so on, but look at the difference between medical books and manga, the Japanese graphic novels, okay? Here you have an incredibly dense social network of people, in particular people that are sitting in these places where are getting recommendations from very, very distal people in different social networks, okay? So you see that by just looking at this study, you see how is it that people who are, you are reading things, you are going to the movies, you are cooking dinner, you are listening to your siblings or whatever at home, and yet there is yet one more message calling for your attention, read this book. Okay, so now look at this book is not something that's being broadcasted. It's essentially someone telling you this through email or whatever. We don't really know. Most likely this is email because otherwise Amazon would not know that this is happening. So here you have an example of something that is extremely rich, very dense, and it gives you a lot of information on the kinds of social environments that are responsible for the selling of things like graphic novels. And you can do this for almost anything that Amazon sells. Okay, so that's not interesting. Now you could also ask, this is to me even a more interesting and simple question, how effective is this overall? So this was a very simple measurement that we made. Here it is. The probability of buying anything as a function of the number of recommendations that people get. And actually it's rather, I would say, not very uplifting if you are working at Amazon. Here it is. Here's the number of recommendations. This is the probability of buying a book. You know, basically all we did was we knew how many people were broadcasting recommendations to people. We capture that. We see how many people bought. This is what we got. So you see that actually recommendations increase the probability you're buying something, but eventually the more recommendations you get, actually the probability goes down. DVDs is exactly the opposite. It's very interesting. DVDs, we see the opposite. Now, there are also, we don't know really the reasons. There are theories. One theory is that perhaps it's more of an investment to buy a book than a DVD that, you know, you pay, what, $11, $12, and if you don't like it, you just turn it off. Books are not, you know, there's a sense of a sunk cost fallacy. You bought the book, you wait something, you feel guilty, perhaps not reading it, so you might think twice before buying it. But here's an example of the kinds of things you can look at by essentially noticing the behaviors of millions of people, basically, that are involved in this. Okay. So that's the network component, as I was saying. There's a lot you can do with this data. As you can imagine, you don't have to be Amazon to start gathering information of this kind, and you know, lots of people are doing it. But again, I thought it was a very interesting first stab at some of this whole notion, and a little bit of a puncturing of the balloon that viral marketing is the way to go about everything. Okay. Now let's look at the temporal domain, which I think is a very interesting one. The reason that I am interested in the temporal domain is because when I think about myself attending to something, I do so because something has come to my attention that is presumably interesting and novel. We don't, there is a phenomenon that is well known to psychologists of habituation, that if I were to say put a pin on my finger, I feel the pain, but if I keep the thing, eventually I just, so goes into some kind of a background noise. The same thing happens with things. I tell you something new, wow, but if someone else does the same thing an hour later, it's not so wow, and by the time you hear it 10 times, presumably you're not even interested in paying attention to it. So the idea in the temporal domain was to see an interplay between attention and novelty, which is a very, very interesting thing. Now, I must tell you that there's immense literature in psychology about this. They put children in front of red balls and little bells, and they notice when they start attending to the bell, and they get tired of the red ball, and you put another thing. I said, immense literature. I was interested, again, in collective attention. I wanted to look at the attention of hundreds of thousands of people and see whether or not, indeed, there is an interplay between attention and novelty. And it turns out that you can do a study of that form. Actually, I did a lot of theory on this. But again, today I'm going to show you the experiments that actually corroborated the theory rather than tell you about the theory, which some of you might find rather boring, all this math and so on. So let me show you what we did. We chose a phenomenal, this is work that I did with Fang Wu, we chose a phenomenally interesting medium to look at this happen in front of your own eyes. And that is, I don't know how many of you know, the so-called democracy of news represented by Digg.com. And if you look at Digg, I don't know how many of you here it is, basically. Digg is this, basically. I mean, it's just, do all of you know about Digg? So I'm wasting your time, I guess? Okay, so I guess you all know. Okay, so now for those of you, I need to tell you a little bit about the mechanism on Digg, which is important. Namely, people look at Digg, and if they like a story, they dig it. So they click on it, and you see the number next to the story, basically telling you the number of digs, how popular the story is. And as more stories come in and more digs come in, essentially the page is again, there's a finite size real estate here, things sort of disappear, okay? But people keep digging because they go to the next page and so on. So we actually saw a very interesting opportunity to actually study the interplay between these two things, and it is immensely helpful if you want to design, say, a website or something where new stories start coming all the time. I always wonder, for instance, how does a newspaper decide what goes on the front page, second page, third page, and so on? I mean, it's an editorial discretion and an art at some level, but we were interested in seeing whether or not we could uncover patterns that could tell you automatic ways of doing this, and indeed that's the case, and I'm going to show you some of that. So the basic idea was we looked at 1 million users of dig.com, every single click they did. Okay, you can go and actually get that data. It's not that difficult. I mean, there are APIs that you can use and so on. So the basic idea was we had a prediction as to what the distribution on, so of all the news that appear on dig, for instance, you know, do all of them get the same number of digs? I mean, obviously not. Some of them will get lots of them because it's a hot piece of news. Some of them won't, and so on. And I didn't really care too much about the nature of the news. I wanted to know if I could predict whether or not there was a distribution, say, just as I was able to predict, for instance, there was a distribution in number of edits in Wikipedia. And in this case, indeed, it's a very nice distribution. It's very well known. I've done a lot of work on this. It's called the log normal distribution. So I'm going to show it to you here. Here it is. It's very nice. This is the frequency. So this is the number of digs against how many stories got so many digs. Okay. So again, you see a very, very skewed distribution in the number. So there are few stories that get about 4,000 digs and beyond. Most stories get, you know, 10, 50, 60, 70 digs, which is what you see. So that's the first thing. That's already interesting because if you are designing a website and you want to maximize the utility that a user gets, how many stories should I put on the front page and how many of them should be with number of digs and so on? This distribution already tells you how to administer that because that's what you expect. So there will be a few that you can calculate that will have many, many, many digs, which means they're going to be very popular. Okay. Now, this is very interesting because if I know now whether or not it is, say, something is very popular or very novel, which are two different things, I can decide whether or not to present one or the other at the top of the page. Dig.com today presents the top things of the page are the most novel, not necessarily the most popular. Okay. Now, I'll show you why this was interesting as a study, but first let me show you what. Okay, so that was the first prediction, that we had a log normal distribution in the number of, in the popularity of the stories. But we were also able to predict how the popularity decays. Namely, people keep clicking on dig and they keep getting stories, but eventually this whole thing starts to saturate, doesn't grow forever. Okay, it grows at the beginning exponentially and then it starts going there, you know, saturates. The speed at which, you know, people add more and more digs on story gets slower, slower as the story gets very old. And it turns out that you can actually do a theory of this and predict that the slowdown of this novelty has a particular behavior that is rather universal. It has a shape that technically is called a stretch exponential. I'm going to show you what it looks like. Okay? And here it is. It's a very nice, this is the curve and the data are on top of each other, so it's a very, very good fit. So basically says that, and I hope that you can all read, that the lifetime of a story decays like e to the minus t to some power less than 1. So it's not e to the minus t, that would be exponentially decaying. It's e to the minus t to a power that less than 1. So it has a very, 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 very long tail. Okay? And from that, we were able to measure the half-life, just like the half-life of anything, 69 minutes. Okay, whatever that means. So this is how long your instant on fame on dig is, basically, on average, about 70 minutes. Okay, about an hour, which is actually something you can see by essentially using it. Most of the time you see that. Okay? Now, the interesting thing about this work is that once you know that these laws or these patterns are so robust and you have a mathematical description, then you can actually start doing interesting things. Like, for instance, we now can calculate, you know, so let's assume that the utility is proportional to the number of hits that a page gives. You know, that's what Dig cares about. Well, should they put the most popular or the most novel? And under certain conditions, because we know the decay, depending on how this novelty decays, it turns out that putting the most popular stuff at the top is much more efficient from the point of view of the number of hits you get than the most novel, and sometimes vice versa. So you can actually see different regimes that you can use in order to actually capture the attention to this. Now you might say, so what? Well, let me give you an example, and this is not a corporate secret. If you look at something, if you ever decide to buy something from Hewlett Packard, where I work, you go to the website, and you see an immense number of products. You can go to any other company, I'm just giving you that example, of things that are presented to you as alternatives to whatever you are buying. I mean, you want a laptop, but there are I don't know how many models, and there are accessories and so on. Once again, the big problem is we have a finite physical real estate, you know, the field of vision. You can go to the other pages, plus the fact that you're not going to spend a year of your life staring at that web page to decide what you want to buy. Okay? Some people might, but most people don't. So the idea is, again, what should you present? And what should you present at the top? Should you present the most novel things, the things that are most popular, and so on? So these kinds of measurements allow you to actually do this in a very, very efficient and automated fashion, okay? Which is very, very important when you realize that a lot of, these kind of patterns of reading news, purchasing, and so on are really done on the web, okay? So, as I said before, and this is really what follows from all of this, okay? So they are actually, as I told you, there's a very interesting tension between popularity and novelty. And actually, we have developed a technique that is very, I find it very cute mathematically or whatever technically, but it actually allows you, if you look at something like CNET, for instance, you want to look at reviews of a vacuum cleaner or a shaver or whatever you want to look at, again, they rank them according to the number of stars that they get, which is, presumably quality. But there might be items in page number 25 of some shaver that actually have only 2 stars, not because people think it's a bad thing, it's just because very few people saw it. So we have ways of measuring the rate at which that little item is essentially accreting stars and being able to mix it with stuff in the front page. We have an algorithm that does that so as to maximize the utility to the user. If, on the other hand, you're the person who sells your stuff through the web, whatever it is, news, your blog, whatever you like, there are ways to actually you can maximize the attention of people using these results, okay? So I will now go for the last piece of it. As you saw, it was collective intelligence and, the phenomenon of attention. To the one that I'm presently doing work on, it's not finished, but we have some results that I'd like to share with you, which is how is it that this collective intelligence expresses itself, namely, how does public and collective opinion form? One of the interesting things about the web, I guess you all know, is that everybody seems to feel totally entitled and, almost asked to write an opinion about something. You look at the way movies are reviewed today. I read, Rotten Tomatoes, Internet Movie Database, whatever, when I go to see a movie. I'm sure you go and buy books and you look at reviews in all sorts of places. Amazon is one of them and so on. And believe it or not, this, again, unsolicited pool of stuff that is coming from people from all over the world are essentially determinants today what we buy and what we think about health, about politics. Look at how people essentially form and deform opinions on the presidential election and so on the basis of stuff that is coming out there in blogs and all sorts of places. Okay, so that's very interesting. It's not new. I'm not saying anything that you didn't know, but I'd like to show you how is it that you can actually go about studying it, and in particular learn something about how opinion is formed. So I'd like to show you this. It's a very recent work that we started, which I think is very interesting. And as I said, I'm interested, why is it that people form opinions about things, okay? I'm talking about opinions that are expressed. I don't talk about opinions that you might have inside your head and no one knows about. And people form opinions about lots of things and never say anything about it. I'm talking about the ones that I have access to, okay, without forcing people to tell me, okay? So that's just really the whole issue here. And so we actually decided that this was a very interesting problem, and I'm going to show you the kind of studies that we did. We had some theoretical ideas, and some of them were wrong, and some of them were right. So now what I'm telling you is based on data. Okay. So let me start by telling you of something that always bothered me, and then I was told that that has been known for a long time. I'm going to tell you about a paradox. Why do people bother to tell you about their opinions? Now, you might say, well, people want to be heard, but the point is, millions of people do the same thing. Now, if you look at Harry Potter books on Amazon and you see the number of reviews that are written, why would you write a review when so many people already wrote the same kind of review? Everybody likes it. Every once in a while you see a negative one, so on. Okay. Now, it turns out, I was told, and it's actually fascinating literature that I spent almost 4 months reading, there is a very important problem in political science. Why do people bother to vote? If you really look at the probability that your vote will decide any outcome, you might as well stay home and enjoy whatever you do at home. Because, quite frankly, it is a very interesting paradox that people still go to vote, even though a rational calculation of what their vote can do to an election is essentially zero. Okay? And so Downs was the first economist to really look at that. There is a very famous work of Reichert and Orderschuk in 1968 already saying that on the other hand, if you feel that the result of an election is essentially very, very uncertain, people will tend to vote more often because then you feel that you can actually have an effect. So if you know that it's 50-50, your vote actually might make a difference and people then tend to do that. There is literature, I'm putting this as a reference. I just was looking at a paper by a political scientist, Schussler in Germany, which is essentially saying there is a cost to voting. You have to go, vote, find out about the issues and so on, but it's also utility from doing so. Some people like the idea that they vote, and actually that's something I enjoy myself, and we like to put this little thing that says I voted, and people do that. Perhaps that's the only reason they vote. We don't know. The point is, the difference between voting and writing reviews of anything, including political ideas, is that usually your review does not decide the outcome of anything, most of the time. Writing negative reviews, okay, if you have lots of negative reviews, presumably that's the case. But it's not as decisive as an election day, where at night you know whether or not someone won or someone lost. The reviews keep piling up, as time goes on, even after the movie's out of the movie theaters, okay? So this is really what we wanted to look at, and I'm going to show you I'm going to go through three very, very big studies that we did, okay, which I think are very, very interesting because they exemplify the kinds of ways that opinion forms, and unfortunately, this also shows you can actually how you can manipulate it. Okay, so let me, why is this doing that? We don't know, but okay. That's Windows again, right? Okay. So the idea then is obvious. You contribute to an existing opinion pool, and then you decided that you're going to have an effect. So now there are many ways you can have an effect. Suppose that I were to take all of you now as you get out of this room, and people were to ask you some random question whether or not you liked the latest movie that you saw. Well, okay, people will give their opinions. You don't know other people's opinions, so therefore other people's opinions are not going to influence you. So the first conjecture was, in websites where people express opinions and they don't have access to other opinions, we should actually see a full random sample of all the opinions and no biases whatsoever. And that's the calibration. And actually we did that. I'm going to show you this. We did it on a very simple website. I don't know how many of you know about Assembly. I don't know if you know. Assembly is a very interesting website. And there are lots of weird things in life. This is one of them, where basically people put motions. I think the United States should have a king, and people vote on that. I'm not kidding you. There are lots of worse things, okay? So here is basically, you count the number of votes on one thing, and you can actually see how many votes were on that proposition after you voted, not before. That's why it was so interesting for us. So this is the number of votes, and if you look at the expectation value of xn, which is essentially, they give it a numerical value, 1 to 5 or something of that sort, or -1 to -5, you basically see that this doesn't show you any trend. Essentially, you're just sampling from everywhere. Okay, so that's one. So that's Assembly, and actually it was a very big study we did on that because that was a very, very interesting one, okay? So there's no history. Now let me show you a situation where there is history. There's another site, even in a sense wackier. It's called jite.com, where anything is really proposed there, and people actually vote, but they also see what people have voted before. So you can go to jite.com, someone is nodding, you know about Jite. It's very funny. I mean, they have classifications of all sorts of issues, and some of them are very, very silly, and some of them are rather serious. But, everything, from not allowing certain kinds of medical practices in England. Someone proposes that, everybody votes on that, even people who are not even living in England. So you go to Jite, and the nice thing in Jite is that you see what people have voted, and then you vote. You have an opinion, but now you're influenced by others. In principle, you're influenced by others. And the interesting thing is that we had a whole theory that actually people were going to be influenced to the point that actually you're sort of a crowd. The crowd influences your momentum. If you see a lot of positive votes on something, most likely you will tend to vote on the positive panel as opposed to the negative one. You see the numbers, so you vote, and then the numbers change. That was our conjecture. If you see something very negative, as opposed to very positive, because most of the votes are negative, you go that way. Okay, so that was a conjecture. It wasn't clear that it worked, so let me just show you. Here it is. It's costless to vote. You don't have to do anything. Just put your mouse on there and click, okay? So here you see in one case where we looked at something that was originally very positive. Someone put something negative. More and more and more negative votes are casted in time. It's a very interesting thing. There's the opposite. Something started, someone made it positive, more and more positive votes are added. And this is summing over many propositions. Once again, I'm giving you statistical averages as opposed to just seeing individual ones, okay? That's a very interesting thing. So there is basically people go in and they are influenced by the people who already voted. And if you see this disparity between positive and negative, say one is larger than the other, you will tend to go with the larger. And they do. Okay, there's nothing you can do about it. It's a very, very robust regularity. Now, We can also do something a little bit more sophisticated, which is now getting closer to the Downs paradox in elections, which is, what if expressing your opinion is costly, like write a review? Now you read a book, you bought a product, and now you're going to get there and type something about it, whatever. You're pleased or unhappy, whatever. That's your decision, but now it's costly. You're going to become publicly known, even without your name, but actually you'll have to put some cost into this because you're going to have to work at writing something that hopefully will make sense to someone else. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about this, because it's important that I do it sort of mathematically. So even though you can say it in plain English, it's important you see the quantitative aspect. Okay. So I'm going to do it very slowly. So you have n people having rated an item with values. So these are numbers, 1 to 5. So in Amazon books, between 1 and 5 stars, whatever you like. Okay. Now the person n number 1 comes and says, I'm going to rate this item. Okay. So how will the average move? Well, there's already an average, and people already voted. 5, 3, 2, whatever. You can compute an average, and that's what Amazon usually tells you, what the average rating for something is. Now I'm going to be person n number 1. I could be the 5th or the millionth person. I don't care. Now I vote. So this is the way it will move. Okay? And it turns out that if you just measure the average difference between the time before you wrote your review and after you wrote your review, you get an expression like this. And this expression is very simple. It tells you that this difference, you want to make a difference, hopefully, that's why you bother to write a review, this difference will go down like 1 over n. We all know that, so what's the big deal? The more interesting deal is the fact that it's also proportional to the difference between your opinion and the average opinion that has been expressed before. So the larger the difference, the more likely it is that you will affect the average. Okay? So if everything was 5, presumably you will bother to write something after many, many reviews that will be negative, a 1, say, or a 0 if you can. Okay? That's the conjecture here. Namely, when it's costly, we will do something that will actually try to make a difference. So we should see exactly the opposite behavior than we saw in JITE. In JITE, we saw everybody was joining the crowd. It was costless. You just click on whatever everybody else is doing, and you feel sort of that you expressed your opinion. Here now you have to work at it. Okay? It's like casting a vote. And so what this predicts, that besides the fact that it's an inference, that actually you're going to do something in order to make a difference. And look at what happens when you really look at, we looked at 16,454 books on Amazon that got more than 20 reviews. There are lots of them, I'll tell you. And so this is a huge number of reviews. And again, the expectation value as a function of the number of votes goes down in this case. Started high, and eventually the reviews starts with a 5, there's another 5, there's a 4, there's a 5, and so on. But on average, the whole thing starts going down. Okay? So there's a tempering fact. Instead of seeing a polarization of opinions, this book sucks or this book is great, you see basically something that essentially tends to go toward the moderate review as opposed to the very extremes. That's very, very interesting. Now, let me show you something else. This is the difference between reviews at every time on average, and you see that the difference indeed increases, which is what we're measuring. Okay? Now, this is very interesting for many reasons, I think. But one of them is, first of all, let me summarize it, and let me tell you why it's interesting. So this is basically the 3 things we know. Okay, so lack of information is obvious. Everybody says whatever. You know what everybody else is saying, you will tend to go with the crowd, but if it's costly for you to express, you will tend to try to make a difference, and therefore, because it's costly now to you to write a review, will do that. Notice that this has a troublesome corollary, that public opinion in the web can be manipulated. All I have to do is to change the sequence in which opinions are expressed. So I'm Amazon. I want a book to get bad reviews or good reviews, and I don't have to lie. All I have to do is just change the sequence in which I present to you the results of the reviews will tend to make you, on average, do something different. Nor do you as a person. If you felt positive about a book, it's not you're going to write a bad review. It's just that the person who was going to write a bad review now feels entitled or enticed to write such a thing because it's such a positive one. Okay? This is basically the whole sort of the gist of this. There is much more that actually can be done on this, and it's very, very interesting, and as I said, something a little bit troublesome, in particular given the fact that we are now in the midst of a very big campaign of ideas and political candidates and so on. But it's a very nice, I think, robust regularity. So I've been listening to myself for almost an hour. I'm sure you already had your span of attention. So I would like to sort of summarize by basically giving you, I hope that you got a message, but I'll say it just in case, that we have now an opportunity that is fairly unique in understanding these very large trends that are starting to happen because the technology has collapsed distance and the cost of accessing other people, okay? The fact that millions of people communicate the way they communicate is because of technology. It's because of the fact that you can send emails at almost costless and email and instant messages and so on. And I think that all it takes is basically a certain amount of curiosity and, you know, a fact, concentrate on certain factors that I think are interesting to really go there and uncover regularities that are very, very strong and very, I think that rather insightful. This is not the only work that has been done in this space, and I hope that you, besides mentioning my colleagues, you know, there are people that are doing, I mean, here they are, there's a whole group doing things in this social space as well, in particular the Wikipedia work, and so on. There are many aspects to it that I haven't even touched. I was just concentrated on the little, you know, pearls that of sort of insight that I feel that I have from this that you might actually enjoy hearing. Now, all of this has a lot of detail under it, so I'm going to give you the website if you want to. You can go there and then grab it. I mean, all the papers are there, some of the data and so on. You can play with it. And if you don't have anything else to do, go to JITE. I think you'll be amused. Thank you.